try to give you some quickly some elements from. I'm really going to use a research project that I've been involved in during 3 years as maybe a way of saying some things about the migration issue that we've been talking about these days. I'm not going to have Eduardo's problem with the PowerPoint because I don't have one. I'm a very incorrect presenter here. But and I'd also like to read something that I wrote in my text, which is from a great Argentinian singer, León Gieco. I try to translate. It doesn't work exactly, but I think you'll get the idea. He says, "If you tell me to go back where I was born, I ask that your business leave my country, and it will be all equal. It will be all equal." Because part and linking with the free trade that Marisol was talking about, which is interesting, those free trade agreements doesn't really mean free trade. It means capitals are free to migrate, but of course people aren't. So we have a terrible contradiction there in the times that we are living in. Like I said, and I was just thinking also of these terms, illegal and documented. I don't know if I'm right, but illegal is the act, you know. And when you say the person is illegal, it has, I think, a whole lot different. I mean, a criminal commits a crime. Of course, a crime is illegal. You don't say it's an illegal person. You say it's a criminal. Of course, you can't say yet that the migrant is a criminal. So when you say he's illegal, you're not qualifying the act of not having documents. You're talking about the person. So it really eliminates the person as a person. And that means that a whole lot of different mechanisms go into it. I don't know if that makes sense. And I just thought about it, but it sort of resonates. In our case, in Costa Rica, the main part of vulnerable migration, which is the migration that we're concerned with, because we have all sorts of migrations. You know, you have investors, they're migrants. They're going to come and buy the land. And they're also, for instance, in our country, but nobody's going to talk about them as migrants. They're investors, they're bringing welfare. And you have other, like, political asylum. Usually it's favored by the governing elites. They're also migrants, and they're not going to have any problem. They're in another category. You have refugees that have some protection, of course, and I'm very glad they do. But you have all the economic migrants, which don't have any protection. And that becomes a big issue. And if you see international human rights congresses about migration, it becomes an issue, but nothing's been solved. They don't have basically any protections. And that's very relevant to what we're doing, because a good part of the Colombian migrants in Costa Rica have refugee status. And in the 1980s, the Nicaraguans in Costa Rica, by the thousands, had refugee status because there was a war with Nicaragua. Now, no Nicaraguan has refugee status, and that means they can't get work permits. That means they can't have a series of benefits that refugees have, which is a way of saying that this all has also a historical basis that you can't ignore. You'll probably be very surprised if I tell you, and there's a very sound, very good book written, research in this. For example, in Costa Rica, around 1939, have biracial migration laws. Jewish people couldn't come in to Costa Rica. And if you look beyond Costa Rica, you could read historical, a lot of historical facts about, for instance, the ships carrying Jewish refugees that were refused in all ports, and I understand in the United States also. So it's, what I'm saying is there are policies, and the policies change with time. And if you look at history, you see many recurring themes. And I think there's very definitely there's an issue of power. If you're talking about the relationships between groups, it's an issue of power. It's a power thing. And those that, even those that don't have power can identify very much with those values or those viewpoints, outlooks, or the powerful groups. I'm reading a book I bought here yesterday, which I thought sounded very interesting, and it's very interesting. They sell it here by a professor, well, he did it in Cambridge, about the Jewish soldiers in Hitler's army. So, you know, and he identifies, he interviewed 430 persons. He did years of research, and he identifies more than 100,000 Jewish soldiers in Hitler's armies. That's counterintuitive for any of us. You know, and of course it's very complex, it's not so simple. But what kind of identity, relationship between identity issues and real life, everyday, and power structures are going on there? It's a very illuminating book. So I think all this goes into place. And part of this, I think, has to do with how, I have a text here and I have a lot of things I could read also, but I don't have the time. It's very interesting to me not to look at the, you know, not say it in a certain sense, this or that, because that's very easy. You know, I'm much more interested in the ambiguous spaces and the contradictions, the difficulties, the contradictions in imageries, for example, all the processes that go on that get very complex. Because when you're in front of the migrant, like Costa Ricans would be, in front of Nicaraguans, which are the historical others, with minuscule letters, while the other, with the big letters, is the U.S. and Europe. They're all others, but you have the little others and you have the big others. So when you're in front of the little others, it really moves imaginaries, it really moves representations, and as I understand it, in the last analysis, national identity, I'm very convinced, we heard it in the lecture at lunch, Anderson, nations are imagined communities. It's a thing of imagination. It's a thing of imagination. You know, of course, it has a very real, materialistic, structural sense, but it's an imagined phenomenon, and it's a resource. The nation is used as a resource to get things. That's why it works. To favor some groups and go against other groups. And that's why it also shifts so much. It can shift so much. Because I think the concrete situations that you face are changing, different resources. So why, well, to me, I see it like that. Why, like you said here, white Americans, you know, feel are more patriotic, or lower class, like somebody said here, more patriotic. Yeah, they feel threatened. Why do they feel threatened? They feel threatened because they feel threatened they can lose power, they can lose resources, they can lose position. So one way of reacting is using something that's very efficient, which is patriotism, national identity. It's sort of the same thing that we see mobilized in Costa Rica in a different sense, because of course different elements go into this. This is part of what I have here. We're researching with Colombians, and the figures, the official figures from the Colombian embassy in Costa Rica say there are 27,000 Colombians in Costa Rica. Costa Rica has 4 million people, 27,000. Nicaraguans, well, the figures is part of the problem, because I say in the text, in a certain moment, the press, all the public opinion, all this, started like a wild dance of numbers. You know, it's 500,000 coming at us. No, it's 800,000. No, it's 1 million. So the numbers, nobody knows. Nobody really knows. But there are hundreds of thousands of people from Nicaraguan origin. But in our case, you have a lot of sons, children of Nicaraguan migrants that are born in Costa Rica. And they are legally Costa Ricans. and you can't send the mother back to Nicaragua or the father in Costa Rica. Legally they're Costa Ricans, but they're seen as Nicaraguans. You know, socially, they're going to receive the whole discrimination that they're Nicaraguans. So it's not a legal problem either. It's a problem in the imaginary, and it gets very complex because it really tenses many of these imageries that my colleagues here were talking about. Costa Ricans are white, Nicaraguans are darker. Costa Rican are pacifists. Nicaraguans, who of course have been invaded, you know, had all sorts of dictatorships, all sorts of problems. But Nicaraguans are warmongers, they're violent. So, you know, Nicaragua, it will be, if there's a crime, the instant, automatic reaction in Costa Rica, it was a Nicaraguan. And when a researcher did, for instance, in the prison system, Carlos Sandoval, and he used it in his research, he asked students and other people what percentage of the people in jail in Costa Rica were Nicaraguans. And people would say 20%, you know, whatever, it's 5%. You know, it's not even proportionate to what is deemed to be the proportion of Nicaraguans in Costa Rican population. So all these things, are very tense, even the ecological issues, which is what Carlos Sandoval, this very important research, has found. Even ecological images are used to discriminate and to put Nicaraguans in their place. You know, they have to be in their place. They can be there, but they have to be in their place, because then they would be dirty. And I always thought it was very paradoxical that when we carried out workshops that we did, I think Marisol had some participation in a course in this, accompanying Colombian migrants, and we tried to work on the images, how they saw Colombians and how they saw Costa Ricans. One of the things that always came up with Costa Ricans that as a negative aspect was the image of trash. You know, Colombians thought Costa Ricans had trash all over the place. And Costa Ricans used that imagery against Nicaraguans. So all this sorts of imagery, I think, gets mobilized in this issue. I would just say that, and maybe we can talk a little more with the questions. Of course, there's a text. I don't know if there's, you know, if anybody's interested and they're not going to circulate it, just tell me. I'll send it to you gladly. But I'd like to say a couple of things about the previous presentations that I've also been involved in, this Calero issue. And I'd like to refer to Glenn's question, whether this discourse is used for internal regulation. And I just want to point out a fact. The same day when the Calero conflict came out, very soon after the whole thing came out, part of the environmentalist movements, activists, put out a public statement backing the government, backing the government's position, and denouncing Nicaragua's actions in the zone, in the ecological destruction. And in that same day, in a speech with businessmen in the northern part of the country, due to the fact that the environmentalist movement had recently partially won a struggle against open air mining, the same day the government was receiving that backing, the president was declaring ecological activists enemies of the state. The same day, which was totally, you can see the complexity of the whole situation, and to me it was just absolutely amazing. But there was an attempt, you know, to put them in their place, saying they're exaggerating, you know, they're radicals, they're stopping progress, they're stopping all this, at the same time that a sector of those were backing the government in the other conflict. So I think it's interesting how things met in in that sense. I don't know, it's 5 o'clock, that's why I'm supposed to finish at 5, that's why.
But I think, we have the room, there's nothing coming out there, people are free to go, so I think we can, proceed into what you wanted to say, and then we have a discussion for those who want to go, extend it, pass the thought.
No, I just very briefly say, specifically in our research, we work with institutions that have to do with migrants, that work directly with migrants, that be it government institution, non-governmental churches. Church, as in the United States, have a very important relationship with migrants, and we also interviewed migrants organizations. But we also wanted to analyze political discourse on migrants. So we interviewed 11 ex-legislators that had to do directly with the passage of 2 migration laws in Costa Rica that I'll tell you about in a moment. Then we also wanted to work on press. We also did press analysis. We worked on La Nación, which Marisol mentioned, and Extra, the sensationalist paper that she also mentioned. We studied 6 years of the way, the image of migrants, and all foreigners, not tourists. We didn't work with the image of tourists. Were presented and discussed in the press. We not only work with news, we work with opinions, editorials, the whole thing that had to do with this, which has also been very, very interesting. And finally, we're interviewing 10 Colombian migrants that have at least 3 years of living in Costa Rica, between 25 and 50, and 10 Nicaraguans that are somehow linked to migrant projects or migrant organizations. We finished that, we're in the process of analyzing that. We have tons of information, data, analysis, but we're trying to combine all this, because this is where it finished, because to us, the interesting thing is that Costa Rica, for different reasons that we're trying to explain, in 2005 approves a migration law by ample majority. It was voted 38-5 in the Congress. 5 legislators opposed it. And it was very much a migration law based on a security perspective. Security. The director of migration of our country told me directly in an interview when we asked him why he opposed the law, why he thought it had been approved with such majority. And he referred to 9/11 and the anti-terrorist doctrine, which is really interesting because I can't figure out how to link that with a poor Nicaraguan migrant coming across the frontier. But he said that was like the general perspective, and also an attempt to copy the rightist Popular Party's law in Spain, which of course is terrible for migrants. Okay, but that was approved. And 4 years later, Costa Rica approves a totally different law by majority. And for instance, Oscar Arias, who was mentioned here, who was elected president again, declares when he assumes before he got elected, that the first law was a draconian law, that it had to be changed. And his party approved the law by total consensus. All the legislators of his party voted for that law. So the question is, how does a country change legislation so quick? What happens for a law to get such majority to go into crisis immediately and to be changed 4 years? I don't think migration laws change every 4 years. I don't know too many examples of this, but that's very interesting because it poses the difficulty of a country like Costa Rica to define itself towards migrants, towards others. And I think there's a principle here. If you have the power to define others, you're defining yourself. And I just thought of that also. But I think it makes sense. If you have the power to define others, you're defining yourself. Are you open? Are you close. You have a close. It's national identity, which we found very easily in the legislators, because some had an idea of Costa Rican national identity as something they long ago finished. It was completed long ago. It's a compact, homogeneous thing. This has to be preserved. It can't be touched. It has to be pure. And other legislators had a very fluid notion of national identity in construction, where others, migrants, were a major contribution because it allowed for diversity, it allowed for cultural richness, which is another topic, because we always talk about migrants in the negative sense. You never talk about it hardly in the positive sense, cultural enrichment. And in the last analysis, we're all migrants. It amazes me how history is forgotten in all these discussions, because I think we're all one sense or another, we're migrants. So if that's true, how do essentialist arguments come in all the time? How does that operate? I want to see that experiment.